Every system built to measure what is happening in the world right now, every conflict tracker, every intelligence report, every international monitoring body with satellites and analysts and decades of accumulated data, can count the casualties, map the active fronts, document the displaced populations, and record the names of the dead. Not one of them can measure what Revelation 6 says was actually taken. And the reason none of them can measure it is the same reason most people have not noticed that it is gone. Peace was not removed in a single event that everyone witnessed. It was taken the way a tide goes out, gradually, almost imperceptibly, until you look at the waterline one day and realize it has been absent for a very long time, and you cannot identify the precise moment when it left. Before we examine what Revelation 6 says was taken, it is worth establishing what the historical record of peace actually looked like when the measurement point begins. The decade following the Cold War's end, roughly 1990 to 2000, represented what historians have called the unipolar moment, a period of unprecedented international cooperation, treaty formation, and democratic expansion. The number of democratic nations doubled in less than 20 years. International trade frameworks multiplied. The institutions designed to prevent great power conflict were functioning in ways they had never functioned before. This is the baseline from which what Revelation 6 describes was removed. Not a perfect peace, not the shalom of Isaiah's vision, but a structural condition that was measurably more present in 2000 than it is in 2026. If this kind of biblical investigation, the kind that goes deep into the text and comes out the other side with answers, speaks to your spirit, subscribe to this channel. This is where we uncover what has been hidden in plain sight. Revelation chapter 6, verses 3 and 4. The Lamb breaks the second seal. The second living creature calls out, "Come!" A red horse goes out. Its rider is given power to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another. And he was given a great sword. John records 4 statements in 2 verses with no elaboration, no description of what the rider looks like, no narrative of where he goes. Just the commission, the consequence, and the weapon. And in those 4 sparse statements, there is more analytical precision about the mechanism of civilizational collapse than most observers have produced in volumes of geopolitical analysis. But to access that precision, you need to understand what the text is actually saying, because the English translation flattens something in the Greek that changes everything about how this seal should be read. The critical word is not the word read. The critical word is not even peace. The critical word is take. The Greek is lambano, to receive, to take, to remove. The verse does not say the rider was given power to cause war. It says he was given power to take peace from the earth. Those are not the same action. Causing war is an addition, inserting conflict into a situation that had none. Taking peace is a subtraction, removing a condition that existed so that what was held back by its presence now fills the vacuum. The distinction tells you what to look for. You are not looking for the moment war started. You are looking for the moment the condition that made sustained peace possible was removed. You are looking for the absence of something, not the arrival of something. And absences are always harder to detect than arrivals. What exactly was taken? To understand that question, you have to understand what biblical peace actually is. And it is not what most Western ears hear when they encounter the English word. The Hebrew word shalom and the Greek word eirene that the New Testament uses do not describe primarily the cessation of armed conflict. Shalom describes something more comprehensive and more fundamental: wholeness, completeness, right relationship between human beings, trust in a shared moral framework, the condition in which communities can function with confidence in one another. Isaiah 32-17 connects righteousness and peace inseparably. The effect of righteousness will be peace. and the result of righteousness, quietness, and trust forever. Peace is not a neutral political condition. It is the social expression of a moral order that is functioning as it should. When the moral order collapses, peace collapses with it. Even if no shots have been fired, the concept of shalom in the Hebrew scriptures reaches deeper than political stability. It is the word used for the state of creation when God looked at what he had made and called it good. Shalom is wholeness in 6 directions at once, between God and humanity, between humanity and the earth, between self and self, between family and family, between nation and nation, and within the internal landscape of the individual soul. When prophets speak of the Messianic age, they do not describe primarily the absence of armed conflict. They describe the return of shalom, the healing of all 6 dimensions simultaneously, the restoration of a world in which right relationship has become normal again. The taking of peace by the red horse is not merely the removal of the absence of war. It is the systematic removal of the possibility of wholeness in any of those 6 directions. It is the fracture of the coherence that allows human civilization to function. Zechariah 9:10 speaks of a messianic promise that stands in direct opposition to what the red horse does. The king shall command peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. The peace that this king brings is described not as the absence of conflict, but as something actively commanded into being. And the means by which this peace is established reveals the contrast most clearly. I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall command peace to the nations. Peace arrives in Zechariah's vision when the instruments of war are removed. The irony that the Messianic king brings into being comes not from military might, but from the systematic destruction of the machinery that enables violence. The red horse, operating in the opposite direction, removes the instruments of peace, the treaties, the trust frameworks, the shared moral language, and allows violence to fill what was once held at bay. The 2 movements run in opposite directions across biblical history, and the rider of the 2nd seal accelerates the movement away from the restoration that Zechariah anticipates. If the weight of what you are hearing, the reality of what was taken and when it was taken, is landing in your spirit right now, write in the comments, God is faithful. Let me know you are here. In the Greek New Testament, irony carries a comprehensive weight that most modern ears miss. When Jesus pronounces peace on the healed or the forgiven, as in Luke 7:50, go in peace, or Luke 8:48, go in peace, he is not saying the battlefield conditions have improved. He is saying that something has been restored to its proper condition, that a relationship has been repaired, that wholeness has been given back to what was broken. The woman at the well receives Irene not because her external circumstances changed, but because her deepest relationship, the one she had hidden from everyone else, was known and loved by Jesus anyway. That is what the word means. It is the peace of being fully seen and fully received. It is the opposite of isolation, exposure, shame. When Jesus offers his disciples Irene in John 14:27, he is offering them this quality of full acceptance and unbreakable presence. My peace I give to you, he says, not as the world gives do I give to you. There are 2 kinds of peace in that statement, and they operate by entirely different mechanisms. John 16:33 contains a statement from Jesus to his disciples that reframes what peace actually means in the context of coming tribulation. Jesus says, "In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world." The Greek word for overcome is nenikeka, perfect tense of nikao, the same root as the overcomers addressed throughout Revelation 2-3. The peace Christ offers is not the peace of undisturbed circumstances. It is the peace of certainty about the outcome. The conditions of tribulation are real and will arrive. but the one who breaks the second seal has already been overcome by the Lamb who opens it. Jesus is not promising that the circumstances will change. He is offering peace in the midst of knowing that those circumstances are coming and that his victory over them is already complete. This peace and this tribulation must be held simultaneously, or the second seal becomes catastrophically disorienting to those who experience it. The Christian is called to inhabit both realities at once: the reality of the world's deterioration and the reality of Christ's victory over it. The world's irene is conditional. It depends on external circumstances aligning properly, on threats being removed, on agreements holding firm, on the machinery of civilization functioning without interruption. The moment any of those conditions fail, the world's peace fails with them. It is fragile in its very nature because it rests on fragile things. But Christ's irene is unconditional. It is the peace of being loved at the level at which the external conditions cannot reach. It is offered to a disciple sitting in an upper room shortly before his execution, and to Paul sitting in a prison cell, and to believers in every generation who have watched the conditions of the world deteriorate and yet carried something inside them that the deterioration could not penetrate. When the red horse takes what it takes, what is removed is the world's version. What Christ gives cannot be reached by the rider. The rider carries a great sword. The Greek word is machaira, and the word matters as much as the word for peace. Machaira is not rhomphaia, the long sword of open warfare between armies and nations. Machaira is the short blade, the knife of close-quarters combat, the weapon of personal violence, civil strife, the kind of conflict that erupts between neighbors, within communities, inside the institutions that are supposed to hold a society together. The sword the rider carries is not primarily the weapon of generals commanding infantry. It is the weapon of ordinary people turned against each other. The Red Horse's primary theater of operation is not the international battlefield. It is the space between people who once shared a community, a city, a country, and a framework for living together. The specific sociological pattern across the 20th century and into our time shows a consistent progression. The machaira of civil conflict always precedes the rhomphaia of formal warfare. The social fracture of the Weimar Republic preceded the rise of the Third Reich. The communal violence in Rwanda in the years before 1994 preceded the organized genocide. The systematic erosion of civic trust in pre-revolutionary Russia preceded the Bolshevik takeover. In nearly every major historical catastrophe of the modern period, the blade that cuts first is not the large sword of formal war between armies. It is the small knife, the gradual cutting of the social connective tissue, the erosion of the shared framework that makes institutions function, the dissolution of the agreement that we are still part of the same community even when we disagree. By the time the rhomphaia appears, the machaira has already done the essential work of making large-scale catastrophe possible. The rider does not begin with the decisive blow. He begins with the cutting that makes the decisive blow inevitable. If this is helping you understand the world around you with clarity that no news channel can give you, hit that like button right now. Not for us, but so this revelation can reach someone else who needs it today. Jesus himself uses the word machaira in Matthew 10:34 in a passage that has often been read as paradoxical. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. The word is machaira, the same blade the red horse rider carries. But Jesus is not claiming to be the agent of the second seal. He is describing an unavoidable consequence of the truth entering a space where falsehood had been the basis of the existing peace. When truth is spoken in a community held together by shared illusions, the result is division, because the illusions cannot survive contact with the truth. The Machaira cuts the false peace so that genuine peace can eventually be built on honest ground. The red horse's Machaira cuts the genuine peace so that nothing can be built at all. Luke 12:51-53 makes the mechanism of this division explicit. Jesus says, "Do you think that I have come to give peace on earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. For from now on in one house there will be 5 divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. Father against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother." The division the red horse carries and the division Christ's truth produces look structurally similar on the surface. Both cut through the connections that once held communities together, but they are different in their direction and their purpose. The truth's Machaira divides in order to expose what was false and create the conditions for genuine reconciliation. The red horse's Machaira divides in order to prevent the possibility of that reconciliation altogether. What this division means in concrete experience is that the Machaira cuts most precisely where trust was most intimate. Statistics on family fragmentation offer what data can measure, but data cannot measure what families experience at the table when the political divide becomes so absolute that Thanksgiving becomes a negotiation. Micah 7:5-6, written 27 centuries ago, describes this texture with uncomfortable accuracy. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. In our time, this prophecy finds expression not in the headlines of international conflict, but in the lived experience of millions of ordinary families in which the ideological or cultural divide has made genuine relationship across the generational or political line functionally impossible. The person who once shared your worldview now represents a fundamental threat. The room that was once shared without calculation now requires constant navigation. The Machaira cuts most effectively where the trust was deepest, because trust is what it cuts. The rider receives power. The Greek is passive, edothi. It was given to him. This is the theological grammar that Revelation uses consistently and intentionally across all the seals. The rider was given, he was permitted, power was granted. He does not seize this authority independently. He operates within a framework of divine permissive sovereignty. Romans 13:1 establishes the foundational principle. There is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. This does not mean God approves of what the red horse does. It means nothing the rider does falls outside the governance of the one who told John to write it all down. The permission is not the same as the endorsement. The sovereign is not the same as the agent. God permits the rider to take the peace because the disclosure of what exists beneath the surface of that peace serves a purpose the rider does not understand and cannot control. Zechariah 8:16-17 prophesies about the conditions of shalom when it is restored. These are the things you shall do. Speak the truth to one another. Render in your gates judgments that are true, and make for peace. Do not devise evil in your hearts against one another, and love no false oath. For all these things I hate, declares the Lord. Notice what Zechariah identifies as the foundation of peace. Truth-speaking, not military might, not economic stability, not institutional complexity. Truth. When communities fragment into competing versions of reality, when the agreed-upon facts dissolve and each group occupies its own information ecosystem, what has been removed is exactly what Zechariah names as essential. The Machaira cuts deepest where truth has already been discarded, because there is no longer any common language in which reconciliation could be negotiated. If you have been feeling like the world is falling apart, and no one is giving you a framework to understand why, like the pieces are right in front of you but no one is helping you see how they fit together, I left something for you in the first pinned comment. It is for those who are ready to go deeper. James 3:17-18 addresses the connection between wisdom and peace with precision that reveals what must be present for peace to be sustainable. James writes, "The wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." Two elements connect peace to something more than political arrangement: wisdom from above and righteousness. James is describing peace not as a neutral state, but as a harvest, something produced by a particular kind of planting over time, by people who are actively engaged in the work of making it. When the writer removes the peace, he does not merely remove a neutral condition, he removes the fruit of decades of careful cultivation, and rebuilding it requires the same patient, costly work that produced it in the first place. Those who understand this are marked for a different kind of work in the age of the red horse. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, has tracked the global state of armament, conflict, and international security since 1966. Their data across the last 2 decades documents what most people have felt but struggled to articulate. The treaty infrastructure that held the international order together for much of the second half of the 20th century has been systematically withdrawn or rendered functionally inoperative. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed by Reagan and Gorbachev in 1987, in force until 2019, when the United States formally withdrew. The Open Skies Treaty, established in 1992, collapsed in 2020, when first the United States and then Russia withdrew. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which defined the strategic relationship between the 2 largest nuclear powers for 30 years, was ended unilaterally in 2002. These are not abstract diplomatic documents. They are the institutional expression of the condition called peace, the formal structures that made certain kinds of violence structurally impossible. Their removal does not start a war. It removes the architecture that made certain wars structurally unthinkable. The United Nations Security Council, designed as the mechanism for collective international action, has experienced an exponential increase in veto usage since 2010. Russia and China have deployed vetoes on Syria-related resolutions at a rate that renders the Council functionally paralyzed on the geopolitical issues that matter most. In the years between 1945 and 1990, vetoes were rare instruments of last resort. In 2023 and 2024, they became routine mechanisms of obstruction. This is not a story about disagreement. Disagreement has always existed among the permanent members. This is a story about the removal of the shared framework within which disagreement could be managed, the norms that held the Security Council together through the Cold War, the understanding that certain threats were universal and required collective response, have been explicitly repudiated by the major powers. The institution still exists in physical form. Its operative capacity, which depends on trust and shared purpose, has been progressively removed. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the institutional expression of security cooperation among democratic nations, has experienced unprecedented stress in recent years. The nuclear security umbrella that held European nations together for 70 years was openly questioned by American political leaders. The commitment of the United States to defend member nations if attacked, Article 5, the foundational promise on which the entire structure rested, became uncertain in a way it had never been uncertain before. Allies could no longer assume that the primary guarantee of their security was assured. When the protection offered by shared alliance becomes uncertain, nations begin to calculate independent security arrangements. This is not conspiracy. It is the predictable behavior of states that have lost confidence that their partners will honor their commitments. The doomsday clock, maintained by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists since 1947, reached 90 seconds to midnight in January 2023. This is the closest it has ever been set in its entire history, closer than the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, closer than the height of the Cold War arms race. The scientists who maintain the measurement are not prophets, and they are not theologians. But they are tracking the same thing that Revelation 6 describes, the removal of the conditions that kept catastrophe at bay. The clock was set at 7 minutes to midnight in the year 2000. What has been removed in the 2 decades since is not peace in the crude sense of the absence of shooting. What has been removed is the infrastructure, the treaties, the trust, the institutional frameworks, the diplomatic norms that made peace a sustainable condition rather than a precarious temporary arrangement. ACLED, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, documented 179,000 political violence events globally in 2022 across 55 countries, representing a 27% increase from the previous year. This is not a measurement of declared wars or formal military conflicts between national armies. This is the count of the Machaira, the short blade, the violence between neighbors and communities, the conflict that erupts inside states rather than between them. The red horse is not primarily riding through zones of declared international warfare. He is riding through cities, neighborhoods, and communities that were, by every conventional measure, technically at peace. Political demonstrations turning violent, communal tensions erupting into bloodshed, civil conflicts fracturing states that had held together for generations. The Machaira is doing exactly what the text says it does, not starting wars, but cutting the connections within which war is held at bay. The Sahel region of West Africa has become the epicenter of global conflict growth in recent years, serving as a critical case study in how the Machaira operates beneath the notice of most international attention. In 2022 and 2023, 9 of the 10 countries with the largest increase in political violence were in sub-Saharan Africa: Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Nigeria's Middle Belt, Ethiopia's various active conflict zones. These are not the sites of formal interstate war declared by governments against each other. They are expressions of the Machaira at its most pure. Communal violence, militia conflicts, the fracturing of the social frameworks that once allowed ethnically and religiously diverse communities to coexist. The red horse does not ride only through the great powers and their treaty structures. He rides through the places where no satellite tracks the blade, where no international body records the cutting, where the erosion of peace happens in the silence that no news outlet considers important enough to interrupt the cycle. And yet, the removal there is just as complete. Most readers of Revelation who think about the red horse imagine a dramatic and obvious outbreak of international conflict, something the whole world immediately recognizes as unprecedented, something unambiguously matching the description of the second seal, but the text specifies something more subtle and more pervasive: peace taken from the earth so that people should slay one another, not armies slaying each other under flags. People, the word is anthropoi, human beings, slaying each other in the context of a world where the condition that once regulated how people relate to each other has been quietly removed. The civil wars of the last 20 years, the political polarization that has restructured the social fabric of formerly stable democracies, the collapse of the shared assumptions about truth, justice, and community that once made disagreement navigable rather than lethal. This is not background noise. This is the sword the rider carries, cutting through the connections on which civilized life depends. Pew Research Center data from 2023 shows that approximately 72% of Republicans and 63% of Democrats in the United States describe the opposing political party as a threat to the American way of life. not as people with different policy preferences, as a threat, the language of existential danger, the language used for enemies rather than neighbors. This is not a disagreement about the marginal tax rate or the proper allocation of federal spending. This is a fracture in the shared moral grammar that made democratic self-governance possible, the assumption, without which democracy cannot function, that the people on the other side of the argument are still your fellow citizens and still deserve the rights and dignity that you claim for yourself. When that assumption goes, the Machaira appears in the space where it used to live. The role of social media in accelerating this fracture cannot be overstated. Platforms designed to maximize engagement and capture attention operate according to a mechanic that rewards outrage and penalizes nuance. The algorithmic curation of content creates information ecosystems in which users encounter primarily material that confirms what they already believe, strengthened by the algorithmic removal of contradictions and alternative perspectives. The result is a culture in which the possibility of shared reality has become technically difficult to maintain. Two people scrolling through their feeds at the same moment, in the same geographic location, may inhabit entirely different factual universes. The Machaira does not need to slay bodies directly when it can first make it impossible for minds to meet. Social media has become the infrastructure through which the rider conducts his work most efficiently, not by creating direct violence, but by making the common ground on which people once negotiated their differences literally invisible to them. When the shared epistemic framework collapses, what sociologists describe as an epistemic crisis, the conditions become ripe for the Machaira's most efficient work. This is different from simple disagreement about facts. It is disagreement about who has the authority to determine what is true in the first place. When universities, media institutions, scientific bodies, religious authorities, and governmental agencies all operate under a cloud of systematic suspicion, no arbitrating authority remains. Every dispute becomes total. Not a disagreement about a question, but a conflict between incompatible realities with no shared court of appeal. The Machaira in this reading is not a blade but a solvent, dissolving the shared epistemic framework that made peaceful resolution of disagreement possible. Once that framework is gone, there is no language left in which to conduct the conversation that would lead to reconciliation. James 4:1-2 locates the ultimate source of the Machaira not in geopolitical calculation, but in the interior life of the human soul. "Where do wars and fights come from among you?" asks James. "Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members?" James identifies the capacity for violence as already present. The epithumia, the craving that competes with the claims of God and community. The rider of the second seal exploits what James identifies as latent human nature, the internal conflict that, when organized and weaponized at social scale, produces the external fracture the data documents. The rider does not create the capacity for violence from nothing. He removes the conditions that once held it in check, the moral framework, the institutional trust, the shared narrative, and allows what was already present to express itself without restraint. The same pattern appears across Europe, across Latin America, across sub-Saharan Africa, across Southeast Asia. The specific political configurations and historical grievances differ by region. The mechanism is identical across all of them: the removal of the shared framework within which conflict could be managed without becoming catastrophic. Not the removal of disagreement. Disagreement has always existed. The removal of the agreed-upon rules for how disagreement is conducted, who has the authority to resolve it, and what happens to those who lose. When those rules collapse, the Machaira fills the space they once occupied. The prophet Micah, writing in the 8th century before Christ, captures the social texture of the red horse's world with a precision that is almost uncomfortable to read in 2026. Micah 7:5-6. Put no trust in a neighbor, have no confidence in a friend. Guard the doors of your mouth from her who lies in your arms. For the son treats the father with contempt, the daughter rises up against her mother, the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his own house. This is not a description of a war zone. It is a description of a community where the baseline trust required to sustain ordinary human relationships between neighbors, friends, spouses, parents, children has been eroded to the point of collapse. Micah identifies this erosion not as a social problem to be managed by better institutions, but as a moral and spiritual condition. The faithful have vanished from the land, and there is no one upright among mankind. The red horse takes peace first by removing the moral foundation on which peace rests. Something in you has been tracking this without having a clear name for it. Not just the international conflicts, you have known about those for years. Something closer. The relationships that used to feel stable, the communities that used to hold together through disagreement. The sense that the world you were navigating had a flaw, a set of shared realities beneath the surface of the arguments that everyone, regardless of where they stood on any particular issue, acknowledged as real. If that flaw feels less solid than it once did, you are not imagining it. You are perceiving accurately. But what you are perceiving is not evidence that God has lost the narrative. It is evidence that the conditions described in Revelation 6 are present and active, and that the God who recorded those conditions did so because he intended his people to recognize them clearly when they arrived. The most important question the red horse forces is not geopolitical. It is not about treaty architecture or institutional trust, or even the statistical measurement of conflict. The most important question it forces is the one Jesus answers in John 14:27. What kind of peace do you actually have, and where does it come from? Peace I leave with you, he says. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. 3 statements. He gives peace. The peace he gives is different in kind from the world's peace. It operates by different principles and is sustained by a different source. And the instruction following, let not your hearts be troubled, is not a command to ignore the real conditions of the world. It is a command addressed to the heart, which is capable of being in a world where peace has been taken and still carrying the peace that cannot be taken. The word troubled, tarasso, that Jesus uses in John 14:1 and John 14:27 appears throughout the Gospels to describe the state of turbulence and disorder. It is used for the stirring of the pool at Bethesda, for the disciples' fear when they saw Jesus walking on water, for the soul of Jesus himself before the crucifixion. Jesus uses this word to describe exactly what the red horse produces in the hearts of those who observe its work. The sensation of a world moving without stable reference points, the experience of being in water that is churning under forces you cannot control. And then he says, let not your hearts be troubled, not wait for the churning to stop, but in the churning, the condition of the heart is yours to govern, because the one who governs the churning is the one you belong to. The interior stability Jesus offers is not dependent on the external circumstances achieving stillness. Acts 10:36 records Peter's declaration to Cornelius and his household. God sent word to the people of Israel, preaching good news of peace through Jesus Christ. He is Lord of all. The proclamation of peace through Christ was not made in a context of external tranquility. It was made in the occupied territories of Roman Palestine to communities fractured by sectarian violence and economic desperation. Peter is not claiming that accepting Jesus Christ would result in the removal of external troubles. He is claiming that Christ's peace is available as a proclamation, as good news, as something actively preached and received, precisely in the conditions where the world's peace has disappeared. This peace is not dependent on conditions being right. It is what remains available when conditions have gone entirely wrong. Colossians 3:15 describes the function of Christ's peace in the internal life of the believer with remarkable precision. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you are called in one body. The Greek word for rule is brabeo, to serve as an umpire, to adjudicate between competing claims, to decide between alternatives. The peace of Christ is given a governing function over the internal life of the believer, not as a pleasant feeling, but as an active arbitrating presence that resolves the conflicts within. When the rider removes the world's peace, the believers who carry the ruling peace of Christ are equipped to be, within their communities, the people around whom fractured individuals can gather and find the experience of a different kind of order. The called-out community is called precisely to carry the alternative peace economy into the spaces the rider has emptied. 1 Thessalonians 5:3 contains Paul's warning about the danger of false assurance in times when the conditions of the world are deteriorating. When people say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them, as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. The phrase peace and safety, eirenikai asphalia in Greek, is the political announcement, the diplomatic declaration, the official proclamation of stability. It is what governments say when they want their populations to feel that the machinery of security is functioning. Paul does not say the declaration is made by evil people with bad intentions. He says the declaration itself signals a profound vulnerability, that a society speaking loudly about its security has reached the moment before the security is revealed to be something less than was claimed. The red horse rides beneath the banner of official reassurance, and often the proclamation of peace is most strident at the moment it is about to vanish. Philippians 4:7 describes the peace of God with a phrase that is worth sitting with. The peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. The Greek word for surpasses is hyperekousa, that which exceeds, that which goes beyond the capacity of rational analysis to fully account for. The peace the red horse takes is the kind that human reason and institutional arrangement can produce and maintain. The peace of God is the kind that exceeds the category of what human reason produces. It operates above the level at which the rider's sword cuts, and the word for guard, phrorise, is a military term describing a sentinel posted at a gate, a garrison maintaining watch. The peace of God stands guard over the places the machaira was designed to reach. It does not prevent the blade from swinging, but it prevents the blade from reaching what it swings at. Isaiah 26:3 adds the mechanism of this guarded peace. You keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you. Perfect peace in Hebrew is shalom shalom, the doubled noun, the absolute completeness of a word repeated for emphasis. This doubled shalom is not given to the one who has negotiated favorable external conditions. It is not given to the one who lives in a stable political environment or benefits from functioning institutions. It is given to the one whose mind is stayed. The Hebrew is so much to lean on, to rest against, to be propped up by, on God. The stability of the mind that produces the doubled shalom does not depend on the stability of the conditions around it. It depends on the stability of the one it is resting against. The red horse cannot remove that anchor. He was never given authority over it. Jeremiah lived through the collapse of the Judean state, the removal of all the institutional frameworks that had held the nation together, the desolation of Jerusalem, the deportation of its leadership. In the midst of these conditions, Jeremiah testifies, "Great is thy faithfulness. Thy mercies are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The prophet does not claim that the conditions are good. He claims that beneath the conditions, available every morning without fail, is a faithfulness that has not been removed. This is what the ancient church meant when they celebrated the lives of martyrs, not that the martyrs escaped suffering, but that they encountered a faithfulness that suffering could not penetrate. Jeremiah's testimony from the deepest conditions of civilizational collapse is available to anyone who recognizes what Revelation 6 is describing and wants to know what to do when the description becomes personal experience. The Book of Lamentations stands as the literature of the Red Horse, the only text in the Hebrew canon written specifically from inside the experience of total civilizational collapse. Jerusalem has fallen. The temple is destroyed. The social fabric has been cut at every level. The instruments of peace have been removed. And in the middle of that text, in the very depths of that devastation, Jeremiah writes the sentence that has sustained believers under the Red Horse in every generation since. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The text does not deny the devastation. Chapter 3, verses 22 and 23 are surrounded by descriptions of genuine catastrophe. Jeremiah is not offering a theological escape from what the writer has done. He is pointing to what exists underneath it, unavailable to the writer's reach. This is the model for how to survive the second seal, not by pretending the blade has not cut, but by knowing where to place the weight. Paul's words in Philippians 4:11 are among the most instructive available for understanding what life under the Red Horse requires. I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. The Greek word for learned is manthano, a school word, the word for acquiring knowledge through instruction and practice. Contentment and the peace that accompanies it is not a condition that arrives automatically with salvation or with spiritual experience. It is learned through a process. Paul learned it in circumstances that included imprisonment, beatings, shipwreck, betrayal, and the sustained threat of execution. He is not reporting that those circumstances felt comfortable. He is reporting that in the midst of them, he encountered a resource that the Red Horse's machera cannot reach, and that encountering it once creates a capacity to return to it under pressure. Philippians 4:12-13 continues, I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. The phrase, through Christ who strengthens me, is often extracted from context and applied to general achievement. Paul is not talking about success in worldly endeavors. He is talking about the specific strength required to maintain the peace of God in the very circumstances where the world's peace has been removed. The strength is not his own, it is Christ, the same Christ who in John 16:33 says, I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I have overcome the world. Tribulation is coming. The peace is not coming. The ability to have peace in the midst of tribulation is what Christ gives. The community of faith is designed, in the New Testament's framework, to function as an alternative peace economy, not a space that pretends the external conditions of the world do not exist, but a space in which a different kind of peace is practiced and preserved as a witness to a world that has lost the original. Hebrews 12:14 commands the community, strive for peace with everyone. The Greek word is dioko, to pursue actively, as a hunter pursues game, with sustained intentionality and against resistance. Peace in the New Testament community is not passively maintained. It is actively pursued in conditions that do not naturally produce it, by people who have access to the only source from which genuine peace can be drawn. That pursuit is not an escape from the conditions the Red Horse creates. It is a demonstration inside those conditions that the rider did not take everything. The early church under Roman persecution became a living testimony to this reality. When Rome was executing Christians methodically, when the state apparatus was dedicated to the elimination of the faith, the church was not producing strategies for political resistance or military response. It was producing communities of such genuine peace and internal trust that they became magnetic to the surrounding culture. Outsiders observing Christian community would report with bewilderment, "See how they love one another." In the midst of a world where the red horse was actively taking peace, where the Machaira was cutting through the normal structures of human relationship, the church was building something that the rider's sword could not reach. This was not because Rome was not trying. It was because the source of their peace was not located in the conditions Rome could control. The church in Smyrna, addressed in Revelation 2:8-11, received no rebuke from Christ among all the 7 churches. Smyrna was under economic persecution, social marginalization, and the slander of those who called themselves Jews, but were of the synagogue of Satan. They faced poverty, tribulation, and the imminent threat of imprisonment. Christ does not promise them escape. He promises them the crown of life if they are faithful unto death. What Smyrna demonstrates is that it is possible for a community to inhabit precisely the conditions the red horse produces: fragmented, marginalized, under sustained pressure, and to hold both the reality of those conditions and the reality of a peace that the conditions cannot extinguish. Smyrna is the biblical template for navigating the second seal with integrity. Romans 5:1 provides the foundational reality that the red horse's work cannot undermine. Therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Peace with God, the primary peace, the peace at the level of the human relationship with the Creator, is not contingent on the external stability of the world. It is a legal status declared by the act of justification, maintained by the one who declared it, and accessible regardless of what the red horse does to the surrounding conditions. When Irene is absent from the earth, when the social, relational, and moral infrastructure that made community life sustainable has been progressively removed, the person who has peace with God still has the peace that Romans 5:1 describes. The rider took the surface. He could not reach the foundation. The transformation the message of Romans 5:1 produces in human consciousness is difficult to overstate. It moves the primary peace from the external conditions, which are unstable and subject to the rider's authority, to the internal reality of relationship with God, which is stable and completely beyond the rider's reach. A person who has navigated the removal of peace in every other dimension of their life, social, political, relational, institutional, but who has established peace with God through Christ, has access to a stability that no amount of external deterioration can remove. That person can then move back into the fragmented world and conduct themselves with a clarity and a conviction that others cannot replicate, because they are not dependent on conditions being right. Ephesians 2:14-17 reveals what Christ accomplished in his flesh regarding the divisions the Machaira creates. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one, and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility. The Greek phrase for dividing wall is to mesotoikon to phragmo, literally the middle wall of the partition, the barrier that keeps people separate. The rider builds walls, Christ demolishes them, specifically in his flesh, in the physical act of crucifixion, which is the ultimate anti-Machaira. Where the Machaira divides, the cross reconciles. Where the rider creates hostility between groups, Christ creates a new humanity from both. The church that understands Ephesians 2 becomes, by its very existence as a multi-ethnic, multi-social community gathered by the cross, a visible refutation of the red horse's primary work. Daniel's model for maintaining peace with God in the conditions of civilizational loss stands as a template for those who must navigate the red horse's domain. Daniel was carried to Babylon as a young man, displaced, stripped of home, immersed in a culture organized around everything contrary to his formation. He did not perform the peace of accommodation or the peace of denial. He carried a settled peace that enabled him to function with extraordinary precision in the midst of a hostile imperial system. He interpreted dreams for kings who could have executed him. He challenged decrees that threatened his life. He prayed 3 times daily toward Jerusalem, even when prayer was made illegal. What Daniel demonstrates is that proximity to the red horse's work, even being a direct victim of it, does not have to erode the inner peace that comes from knowing which direction to face. The circumstances of Babylon could not dictate the content of Daniel's interior life. Hebrews 12:14 commands the community, "Strive for peace with everyone, and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord." The word strive is dioko, pursue, chase, as a hunter pursues prey. Peace in the context the rider has created is not found by waiting for conditions to improve. It is pursued deliberately against the current, in the direction the rider is moving away from. This means choosing truth-speaking when calculation is easier, choosing presence in broken relationships when distance is more comfortable, choosing the common humanity of the person across the political divide when the algorithm rewards treating them as an enemy. This is the pursuit of Irene in a world that Machara has been cutting. And it is not optional. It is the mark of those who have encountered the peace of God and cannot help but carry it into the fracture zones. The faithful in every generation that has faced the red horse in its most severe expressions have not been promised immunity from its work. The believers who survived the Roman persecution, the Christians of Rwanda in 1994, the church under the systematic violence of political purges, they were not protected from the rider's reach in the physical sense. What they preserved, what the Machaira could not finally cut, was the testimony that Revelation 12:11 describes. They conquered him by the blood of the Lamb, and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives even unto death. The love of life, the commitment to physical survival as the primary value, is exactly what the Machaira exploits. Take it from those who hold it too tightly, and you can make them do anything. In those who have already settled that their life is not their own, the Machaira finds nothing to use. The testimony of faith is not a claim that God removes the rider. It is a claim that in the presence of the rider, in the midst of the rider's work, the God who gave the rider his commission is more powerful and more worthy of loyalty than the threat the rider represents. When the early church declared that they must obey God rather than human authorities, they were not claiming that human authorities lacked the power to execute them. They were claiming that God's authority exceeded human authority in worth. The Machaira could kill the body, but the God who was in relationship with that body, who had declared peace with that body, who had justified that body, who was committed to bringing that body through death and into resurrection, that God was more real and more binding than the blade. What this means for how you live in 2026 is not an abstraction. It means that when the fracture lines in your community become most visible, when the Machaira cuts closest, when the social conditions the rider has created make ordinary civil life feel increasingly fragile, you're not without the resources to navigate them. You have a peace that does not depend on the stability of the conditions around you. You have a companion who is present at the point of greatest pressure and who has already navigated death and emerged from it. You have a framework that names what is happening accurately, which means you are not confused by it in the way that the unprepared and the unanchored are confused. And you have Philippians 4:6, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. The second seal does not open because the Lamb has lost the story. It opens because the Lamb chose to break it, to disclose to his people, in advance and in writing, what the age they would inhabit looks like, so that nothing about the removal of the world's peace would appear to them as evidence that God's hand had lifted. The rider was given power, the giving was sovereign. The commission has limits that were set before the seal was opened. The Machaira cuts through what it was permitted to cut, and the one who permitted it is the same one who stands at the end of Revelation 19 with many diadems and a name written that no rider and no sword can erase. The second seal is not the final word on what the earth's peace will look like. Zechariah 9:10 speaks of a king who shall command peace to the nations, a peace that will extend from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. Isaiah 9:7 describes a government of ever-increasing peace that will have no end. Revelation 21:4 records that God himself will wipe away every tear from every eye, that death and mourning and crying and pain will be no more. The peace that the rider was permitted to take is exactly the peace the Lamb will restore at a scale the rider could not have imagined taking. The seal is broken. The peace is absent. The God who broke the seal is the same God who holds the final restoration. These facts do not exist in tension. They belong to the same story. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, I am not alone. I've placed another video on your screen right now, your next step on this journey. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.